I hope I'm not interrupted anyway. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, my respected viewers, wherever you are. We are at it again. Intellectual discourse at Al Mustafa International University. And today, the topic we are going to discuss is the comparative analysis of social contract according to our great scholar Allama, Tabataba'i, and Max Weber, our great scholars. And it is very important, to discuss the issues pertaining social contracts. So first of all, we need to be able to know when we say social contract, what do we mean by those social contracts according to the lexicographers? So the lexicographers, they say social contract is an implicit agreement amongst members of society to cooperate for social benefit. So, when there are two or more people together and they agree on certain principles and all of them abide by those principles, those principles, are what are known as social contract, because all of them, they respect those principles and they agree to abide by those principles so that together they can be able to live in the caravan of humanity in that society. So our talk today is going to be around this social contract. And like as the heading says, we are going to look at from the Shia scholars' perspective and as well as the Western empirical perspective. So we are not going to only talk about what the great scholar Max Weber has mentioned. We will also talk about Mr. Thomas Hobbes and also Mr. John Locke and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau in terms of their contributions in regards to social contracts. So if you look at social contract, those scholars, from the 16th, 17th century in medieval Europe, they were the founding fathers of those social contracts. Thomas Hobbes was an English, philosopher who was born in 1588 until 1679. John Locke as well was from medieval Europe, who was born in 1632 and he passed in 1704. Jean-Jacques Rousseau also in 1712 and 1779, as well as Max Weber in 1864 to 1920. So these are the great scholars in terms of social contract. Whenever you talk about social contract in the Western schools, in the Western environment, these are the founding fathers of this social contract. And as well as our great scholar Allama Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Tabataba'i, his concept in which he came up with to be able to define and give us the understanding of what social contract is all about. And bear in mind, like as I told you, social contract is the implicit agreement. Like today's world, like recently, we are all witness to what is happening in the United States of America, where people are voting to choose their leader. So this is a form of a contract that brings, people to agree on a certain pattern. And that pattern is very important because that is what governs the society that they live in eventually. So we have to know this social contract. How can we come with these laws? Are we going to come up with laws from religion or from natural laws in which we can put them together to formulate the social contract? Because remember, when we talk of social contract, it is about everybody that lives in that society, the safety of that individual in the society, the development and all aspects of this individuals is very, very important. So that is why it is very important for us to have, very strong, propositions that can be defended, propositions that are able to, take care of the entire, humanity that agree to live together in a community or a society. So like today, you see in America, between Donald Trump and what is the name? It just escaped me. You see that people have the choice to choose, each other. And in terms of social contract, we have so many forms of social contract that, we are not going to talk about that now. In the near future, when you have the opportunity, we could talk about, we have social contract that are, open contracts, and we have closed contract, and we have bilateral contract, as well as we have, multilateral contract. Example of, closed contract are contracts that are there between two or more people, which they agree that they need to live up to that contract. And we have open contract, which is not closed, but it is still observed. Like you see in life, human beings living with other human beings, there are no exact contract that defines how to live with each other. Like for instance, there is a contract that says that primarily every human being has right to self-defense. So this contract, even though they are not enacted, but they are contracts that are observed from the natural laws that exist in this material world. And also, this bilateral contract are this, the ones that are closed, and we have multilateral, the ones that are open generally, like self-defense. Of course, everybody is entitled to defend themselves. So the question is, this social contract, how did this social contract emerge, came into, the medieval 21st century, which out of it we have these laws that governs each and every society, community, and countries at large, or even the world at large. Where did all this emanated? We realize that from the research, those scholars, the Western scholars that I have mentioned, they are the ones that are accredited in terms of the social contract, them being the founding fathers of it, who came up with it, and eventually some countries adopted this contract, this social contract that they came up with. So because of that, I would like us to delve a little bit into this contract that were brought to us by those Western scholars. And the first one we will begin with is, the theory of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes had a very good theory, the theory of social contract. And if you look at, the theory of social contract of Thomas Hobbes, which emanate from empirical theories. And when I talk about empirical theories, theories that are based on sense perception, theories that are not based on, things that are out of matter and materiality. So Thomas Hobbes, in his theory, he mentioned that social contract is a sort of a political authority. Okay, it's a political authority. And political authority here means that how group of people come together and they agree on a set of rules, their economic, social, political, life. How are they going to be able to live in that perspective? So Thomas says that political authority and obligations are based on an individual self-interest. Okay, so you see that his definition comes from the law of nature. So it is based on individual self-interest. And primarily as human beings, because we have free will, each and every human being has free will. And primarily because we have free will and we have desires, of course, we would like to satisfy our individual desires in our communities and society. And of course, provided we have free will and we have desires, sometimes in our quest to quench our desire, we might end up violating the right of others. So if we want to enact rules, contracts, that can govern all of us so that we cannot violate the rights of each other, how are we going to be able to come up with this law? So Mr. Thomas Hobbes said that it is a political authority. In other words, we need to enact a political authority and we have to have obligations which are based on the individual self-interest of members of society who are understood to be equal to one another. So all those laws has to govern and to observe the right of each and every individual in that society. So if each and every individual's interest is not observed, then of course that will lead to social discrepancies. It will lead to this social inequalities. But once the individuals of each and every individual is observed, that is what enact a correct and inclusive social contracts. So that is why it's very important to look at what Thomas has mentioned, and we look into it holistically to understand as to whether this method could solve and accommodate each and every individual in society. So Thomas continued and he said, it is self-interest of members of society who are understood to be equal to one another, with no single individual invested with any essential authority to rule over the rest. So nobody is superior over the other. All of us, we are equal in terms of how we live and how we preserve and protect the right of each other. But he made a very important point at the end of his definition of social contract, where he says that while at the same time, maintaining the consecutive position, that is the sovereignty or the monarch that is taking care of the society, must be ceded absolute authority if society is to survive. So upon all the freedom, there have to be that leadership, there have to be that sovereignty that is within the people, but there must be a leader who will be someone that people will look at him and adhere. In other words, we need to have leadership, we have to have a president, we have to have governance, we have to have the arm of government, the rule of law, the law enforcement agencies and all that. So the question is that if we are going to have these structures in place to be able to see to it that there is peace within the social contract, which covers the economical, the social, the political of human beings. The question is, provided we have leadership, do we really agree, or does it make sense that this leadership are going to be there to see to it that they take care of the needs of entire humanity. Like what we see today in our different, countries altogether. How many people are imprisoned or they find themselves in the wrong side of the law just because they want to demonstrate their freedom. They want to, live a free life, like as, Thomas has mentioned. So, based on the assertion, the theory of Thomas, it becomes very clear that once there is a sort of monarch in place who is, overseeing to the rights of individuals, one way or the other, there will be some others who will be violated. And that itself, will create that inequality and imbalances in community and society. So this is what Mr. Thomas Hobbes, who was born in 1632 to 1704, came up with in terms of, his definition, his theory of social contract. Now, let's look at the second most, intellectual philosopher who also came up with a theory of social contract by the name John Locke. So John Locke also was an European. He was a Western philosopher who was born in 1632, and he parted ways with this material world in 1704. So John Locke also had his theory in terms of social contract. Coincidentally, John Locke had more or less the same idea of Thomas with a little difference. Because John Locke said that, of course, we need that social contract that will oversee the right of every individual in the society. A social contract that will observe the right of each and every single individual in the community or society. But at the tail end of his theory, he mentioned that the individuals, they have the right to stand against the leadership who are overseeing to the right of everybody in that community and society in case they violate the rights, because they, as the leaders, also must conform with the rules and the regulations which will lead them not to violate the right of the community and society. So John said that the society have the right to stand against, to revolute, to fight against the leadership. Okay? To fight against the leadership if the leadership fail to live up to expectation. Because in his session he said that if human beings are going to enact a social contract, they will live side by side without any difficulties. So in the initial stage of their life, it is peace and harmony that will prevail, simply because a human being has that emotional consideration whereby he will consider, the pain or the difficulties of his brother or the other humans that are around them. So that itself will keep human beings on the path of success in terms of their social lifestyle, which cater for all aspects of their lives. So he, in the tail end, what he said, which was different from what Mr. Thomas has said, is that he said, yes, because people have the right to stand against the leadership if the leadership is not doing what it ought to do for the safety of the society. So that created, because according to what Mr. Thomas has mentioned, that the people or the society must abide by the leadership no matter what, so that there will be peace. And the reason why he said that is because he knows that if the society get to a point where they have to revolt against the leadership, that is going to generate into chaos, a chaos that could lead into war. So for the avoidance of war, it is good for the society to adhere to the leadership of the community. Meanwhile, John Locke says, no, the society, they have the right to stand against the leadership if the leadership are not, in the position of doing what they ought to do as leaders, so that they can change them and bring new leadership who will feel the act and the contract that exists between the society and the leadership of the society. So this is, in a nutshell, the assertion of Mr. John. Now let's come to one of the great scholar also, who also brought his idea. He contributed his idea into this, discourse of, social contract, by the name Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in 1712 and he died in 1778. Okay. He also has a very profound theory in terms of social contracts. So what is his theory? Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that if you look at human beings, the social contract or the social contract between a society comes from the state of nature. In other words, all the rules governing human beings, all of them, they can be seen in the state of the nature of a human being in the world he lives in. So he goes further by saying that if you look at how life used to be, in the early centuries of human existence, human being naturally, had these rules which from the state of nature. Like for instance, if you look at us as human beings, naturally we are emotional beings. So in terms of our emotions, we have certain things that guides our emotional principles. For instance, in terms of how we love and how we hate, there are emotions that governs that aspect of our lives. And because of this governance, we are able to understand each other and to reciprocate one another. So sometimes, you love someone and the person is able to reciprocate that love. This law is not a law that was coerced by any leader or authority. No. This law is a law of nature. We can go on and on in terms of nature, law of nature. Even the marriages that took place between husbands and wives, all these things, they are enacted from the law of nature, so that there will be that reciprocal, approach towards the life that we live as human beings. So Jean-Jacques, in his assessment, he said that from the early beginning of human existence, every social movement or the social life that they lived during that time was governed by this natural law, and they were at peace with each other. Anything that they needed as humans was readily available, and there wasn't competition and challenge as to one desire to have more. Like as I've said, because human beings, we are made up of free will and desire. When there are challenges, one person wants to take everything for himself and to neglect the others and the feelings and the lack of having for others. He only wants to take for himself. But Mr. Jean-Jacques says that for all that time, people lived side by side without any difficulties and challenges, because everything that they needed, everything that they want was easy to come by, because people were living in this nomadic lifestyle. They live separately and they have the land in which they farm and they are able to feed their families, and they have empathy and consideration for each other, and all that kind of life was governed by the law of nature. But when did the human being began to experience these problems that has escalated, that love and cohesion has existed between human beings until it got to the position where people end up following their desire, and as a result of their desire, they want to take over everything. So Jean-Jacques said that it is when this, industrialization, this technological advancement started being witnessed by humanity. And when humanity or humans started, claiming ownership to the nature, claiming ownership to land and property, it is then that this aggression which emanate from the desire of a human being started surfacing. And the problem of our society, the problems that we have in our society, all of it came from that source, because we started fighting for, having and taking whatever that is around us to satisfy our desire and our egos. So this is what Jean-Jacques said. And in his assessment, he said if it wasn't because of these, industrialization and these, revolutions that we have, which has brought us this, industrial lifestyle, the law of nature alone was going to suffice within human beings to be able to live side by side with each other. And remember, everything these great scholars, everything that they have mentioned, it is based on empirical understanding, meaning that it is based on sense and experience perception, because the laws comes from the law of nature, and the law of nature is able to be enacted through sense and experience. So as a result of sense experience, they came with these three different theories that they see that it has been the foundation of the law of this universe that we call our universe. Okay, now let's come to what Max Weber has mentioned. And it is very interesting. If you look at what Max Weber has mentioned in his assertion in terms of social contract, Max Weber was not very clear categorically as to whether his theory is based on sense and experience perception, because he realized that there was something that is missing. Because if you are going to talk about social contract, and social contract is going to be limited to sense and experience, then there will be certain things that will be lagged in that perspective. So Max Weber, in his definition, he says that social contract is a law if it is extremely guaranteed. If it is extremely, I want you to underline this word, if it is extremely guaranteed by the probability that physical or psychological coercion will be applied by a staff or people in order to bring about compliance or avenge violations. So you see, he made a very important statement here by talking about the physical and psychological tendencies. So this assertion of Max Weber brings another dimension of social, lifestyle of human beings. If you look at the first three scholars who mentioned their theories in terms of social contract, hardly did they talk about the psychological tendencies of human beings. They didn't explicitly, even though it might include these psychological tendencies, but they didn't explicitly. That is why if you look at their laws, their laws are based on, justice. Okay? It is based on justice from empirical perspective. It doesn't go beyond justice beyond empirical perspective. But if you look at the definition of Max Weber brought a point. So that is why if you look at, later scholars, when they came and then they looked into the work of Max Weber, some of them said that he was not categorical in terms of the statement that he made as to the psychological tendencies of human being. Does it mean that he perceive certain tendencies of human being that is beyond this empirical perspective or not? So that is why it is worth mentioning that whether it is explicit that he is talking about metaphysical, realities, which is beyond empirical sciences, or he is talking about something that is equivalent to empirical sciences, there is that room. So that is why some scholars said, Max Weber, in his assertion, he didn't say it is or it ought to be, because they don't see that clear-cut definition of his, theory in terms of social law and liberty for humanity. So, from that part, it becomes very interesting that we need to explore that psychological tendencies that Max Weber has alluded to. Then after that, we will look at what our great scholar, Allama Tabataba'i, has mentioned in terms of, the rules that are there to govern society, to enact the rules for a community and society. First of all, if you look at the principles of empirical sciences, and like as I said, when I say empirical sciences, I'm talking about, epistemological understanding of everything that is matter and materiality. So if you look at the great scholars who worked under these empirical theories, they have come to the realization that if you look at existence is imprisoned in causation. In other words, everything has cause and effect. For instance, when we talk of causation is equivalent to cause and effect in material realm. That is what they speak about in terms of, causal nexus. So they say that, for instance, like you can become a father and you are at the same time a son. Like for instance, you are a father and a son at the same time, because you as a father is because you have a child, and you are a son because you have a father. So causality is what governs this universe according to the empirical sciences, which inspired these great scholars that I've mentioned for them to come to this social contract. So it is limited to that aspect of our existence, which is something that is within matter and materiality. So, okay, when we talk about, causal nexus, by equating cause and effect, which result into new phenomenon in this universe, it means that existence itself is equivalent to matter and materiality, according to these empirical sciences. But the fact of the matter is, if we equate existence to be equivalent to matter and materiality, and all the rules and whatever is going to come from that perspective, then are we going to have a universal law that will encompass, all the problems and challenges of humanity or not? For instance, if the empirical science says that, and the existence of a matter, if you want to investigate into a matter, you have to look at all the empirical aspect of it, like a human being. You want to know who is a human being. What are the key things you need to look into, the essence of a human being? Okay, from the empirical perspective, you need to only look at, the material component of a human being. And once you're able to look at the material component of a human being, it is only then you can be able to understand, what are the functionalities of a human being. Okay, So from the empirical perspective, we understand that human being is made up of components. And these components are material. And once we equate the existence of human being to this material component, automatically the effect of this human being is going to be limited to, matter and materiality. So that will be very difficult to deny the psychological tendencies or spiritual tendencies of a human being, because it does not address that issue. It is only looking at the physical component of a human being, and as such it will be very difficult for it to be able to cater for the psychological component or the spiritual component of a human being. So that is why, for you to be able to understand the cause and effect that exists between human beings and what they do, you need to understand the entirety of a human being, not only from the empirical aspect, but also from the philosophical aspect, which goes beyond matter and materiality. Like for instance, if you look at a human being, if you limit human being to this material body, okay, then it comes to a point as to whether you have to either substantiate the argument that says that human being has other, realities that are in human beings, like the soul. You have to either substantiate it or deny it. So how do you substantiate it and how do you deny it? Of course, we know, if you look at the human being, if you assess human being, within human being has cells, different types of cells, that keeps him afloat in the world of life. And those cells, periodically, they die and they are replaced with new cells within human, component. And those cells, keeps the human being floating in this material world. And the dead cells are removed from this human being. But from all this time, the human being remains who he is. He doesn't change. So this clearly tells us that there is other, component which is beyond this matter and materiality, which, makes up who human being is. So whenever we want to enact a social contract, there is no way that social contract can cater for the entire need of a human being if it does not encompass the philosophical tendencies, that the spiritual aspect of a human being. If it doesn't encompass it, then it becomes very, very difficult for it to be able to cater for the entire needs of human being. Let me give you one example. If you look at what all these great scholars have mentioned in terms of social contract, if you look at the first scholar, the first scholar in his assertion, that is Thomas Hobbes, he said that these laws comes from nature, of course, but there must be a leader who's going to supervise all the laws so that it can cater for the political, social, economical aspect of human beings, so that there couldn't be disagreement and war between the people. So the leadership will oversee to it as to how they will prevent these problems to happen. Okay, so that itself means that human beings have that tendency of being aggressive to each other. So somebody will use his aggression to take from somebody. And when he takes from that person, what is going to happen? The same way, if you look at John Locke and what he said human beings, the difference between what he said and what Thomas has mentioned is that human beings have the right to revolt and bring in new leader. And even if the new leader also comes and he fails to follow the duties and responsibilities of the caravan of humanity, he can also be removed and bring another one. So of course you could see you can see you can cite aggression and war within this social contract that has been brought to us from this our learned scholars. The same way, if you look at the third Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his assessment as well, he made it categorically clear that because of this industrialization, we came to the position where, there are thus, problems that one person wants to take everything for himself. And that is where this aggression of one person to the other, came to bear. So the question that I will ask is that, based on these theories, let's assume that if somebody violates, the contract, violating it in the sense that he takes what belongs to someone, and based on the rules, the judiciary, the law enforcement, the person is arrested and the person is sent to court. He goes to court and he fails to defend himself. What happens to that person? The person is sent to prison in isolation. Okay, so the question being, if the person took something valuable from this fellow, does the government pays back to that fellow what the person has taken from? Or does imprisonment equivalent to what the person has lost? You see, from this law of nature, it cannot encompass everything in this, regard. Why? Because even if the person is imprisoned, the one that lost his belonging is still, bleeding, because imprisonment doesn't bring what he has lost. It doesn't bring back. It's like somebody kills someone's father and the person is imprisoned. The imprisonment doesn't bring the father of the person that has lost his father. It doesn't bring that father's back. So there is no way it can compensate holistically for the one that has lost. So that is why a law that has to govern society has to be a holistic law, which will cover all the pain or all the loss one loses in terms when there is an aggression over him. So that is what brings me in to the concept of Allama Tabataba'i in his statement in regards to how social laws has to be looked into. In Allama Tabataba'i's assertion, Allama Tabataba'i brings to us three ways or three methods in which issues pertaining religion and social contract has to be looked into. Okay, so he brought these three methods in which social contract has to be looked into. First of all, Allama Tabataba'i said that if you look at the needs of humanity, the entire needs of human beings, from religious perspective can be categorized into three categories. The first category can be looked from the perspective of revelation, whereby we have Quran, we have the Holy Book, like the book of Jesus Christ, the book of Moses. From a religious perspective, we believe that these books are revelations from God Almighty. And these revelations, they are sent to us so that they can guide us, they can give us a guidance as humanity. Bear in mind that the revelation also is aware of the free will of man and also, the desirabilities in human beings. So the verses or the revelations comes to give us guidance. And whatever the revelation says, it is not to be based on human nature or the law of nature. The revelation exceeds what the mind can enact from the law of nature. So from the beginning, we as religious or all the religious bodies are urged to abide by those revelations, regardless as to whether their thinking ability, their empirical experiment could understand what it says or not. A question that will come is that how should one follow blindly? How should one, accept something that from his intellectual aspect he cannot understand? No. Allama Tabataba'i said that religion is not only limited to revelations. No. Religion goes to also intellectuality, intellectual abilities and capacity. If you come to the Quran, you see not only the Quran, the divine books, it talks about challenging human beings to use their intellectual ability, which they get inspiration from the law of nature. So we ought to think, we ought to use our intellectual abilities. We need to think to know and decipher as to what is right and what is wrong. But the question is, this profound thought process, does it overrule the revelations that are revealed to us to guide us or not? Do they overrule? Allama Tabataba'i says, of course. These intellectual abilities God has given to us does not overrule. It doesn't overrule. It doesn't overrule the revelations that has been revealed to us. It does not overrule. So as long as we are urged to use our intellectual ability, we have to be mindful that intellectual abilities are very good, but they have their limitations. Like as I made an assessment in terms of this empirical, understanding in terms of how to enact the law of nature or, the laws of society. If you are going to only look at it from the empirical perspective, what the mind can understand, then of course there are things you are going to miss. There will be very important things that you'll miss. So the second stage Allama Tabataba'i mentioned is about these intellectual abilities of human beings. And then the last stage he mentioned, which is very important, is the gnosticism, the spirituality that is there in the human beings. According to the teachings of Allama, he says that every human being, you have that sense of, religiosity, which is a knowledge within yourself. It is not knowledge through acquisition. It is not knowledge through your sense perception or your intellectual understanding. No. It is a knowledge that emanates from your intuitional understanding, your inner understanding. Like for instance, there is no human being who have to think about who he is before he knows that he is who he is. Like for instance, if I ask you, do you need to think to know who you are? Of course, no. You don't need, because your existence and your awareness is embedded in you. It is intuitional. So Allama says that if we want to address the problem of human beings, then we need to be considerate of these three very important. The first one is revelation. The second one is our intellectual ability. And then the third one is our nature of gnosticism, our spirituality, our, internal witnessing. So in conclusion, if you look at what Allama has said, if you are going to use that method to solve the fundamental issues of this universe, to enact social contracts, from this perspective, we understand that human beings are not only limited to empirical and sense perception. Human beings, we exceed empiricism and we go to the world of, souls and spirit. So we say human being has a soul. We have soul. And whenever we want to come up with a rule, it has to encompass not only the physical component, but also the spiritual aspect in us. So if you look at the laws, the divine laws, even though from the law of nature we are able to enact, but whatever that happens in this material world, it does not end here. It has to continue to the metaphysical world or to the metaphysical stage of reality, whereby if somebody, instead of adhering to the law of nature, which is from the intellectual perspective, from what our great philosophers have mentioned, the Western philosophers have mentioned, instead of relying solely on that, we go beyond and we understand that no, it has its limitation. And beyond the limitations, the empirical sciences cannot be able to understand. So like for instance, if someone kills someone, okay, from empirical laws, there are different laws. You go to other parts of the world, they will say the person must be killed. If all indications are that the person killed, intentionally he must be killed. Some other law says no, he shouldn't be killed. He should be imprisoned, life imprisonment. Okay, from whichever way you look at it, if your father has been killed and the killer of your father is going to be imprisoned or be killed, will that satisfy you? Will that, be able to compensate you fully or not? Of course, the imprisonment or the killing of that fellow doesn't bring my father back. So if the world is going to, remain in this empirical understanding, then it means that the pain that I have in me will remain in me until I also depart in this world. And there is no compensation afterwards. There is no compensation because life is limited to this matter and materiality. So when I die, it's finished. But from the explanation of Allama, it indicates that because we are spiritual beings, our existence should be seen beyond material realm. And that is why if you page the religious books, it says that if someone dies, in the day, there will be a day, which they call it the day of judgment, where there will be compensation to what resulted into the death of that person. So yes, from the law of nature, there will be some sort of compensation, but that compensation cannot, encompass absolute compensation for the one that has lost. So there must be a day when that person will be compensated fully. And that compensation will be in the day where all humans will be assembled. So the spirituality of human being means that human beings are not limited to this material or sense perception. They exceed beyond. And the death of humans does not limit their existence. They proceed and continue from that aspect, which is the spiritual aspect of their existence, through to the day of judgment, where, everything that the law of nature has enacted, that day it will be looked into. And there are other things that are going to be either for the good things humans have done or for the evil things they have done in their society or in their communities. So in conclusion, by doing this analysis, looking at this, analysis between our great scholars, from the Western aspect and from Islamic perspective, we see that they view things from different aspects. And if you look at how the Western scholars or the Western philosophers from our explanations have explained, everything is based on the law of nature. So this social contract is derived from the law of nature. A law of nature that is limited to empirical sciences. While our scholars, like as I quoted, I mentioned from Allama, he says, no, social contract cannot be limited to the law of nature because the life of a human being exceeds this sense perception or this empirical sciences. So if we really want to have a correct social contract, we need to view it from the holistic existence of man, which is from the physical component and also from the metaphysical, which is the spiritual component, to be able to enact a law. So that is why if you page the books of God like the Quran says that in the day of Qiyamah everybody will be resurrected and reward will be given. So the question is, if the reward is already given based on sense perception, then which reward are going to be given in the day of judgment? Of course, rewards are given, but these rewards do not satisfy outright, the needs of human beings. But the reward that will satisfy outright the needs of the caravan of humanity will be the rewards that are going to be in the day of judgment, as well as punishment. There is no punishment, life imprisonment, killing someone because he killed doesn't satisfy the one that has lost absolutely in his existence. These will only be completely satisfied in the next world, because man is made up of physical and material. So in a nutshell, this is what I have in terms of the comparative analysis of social contract according to the great Western scholars and the scholars of Islamic perspective. And inshallah, we hope that what we have said is somehow beneficial, and if there are some other things, observations that you my respected viewers have, you are welcome to raise them so that we can see how better we can be able to develop this. And inshallah, we are working hard on this, and the paper from this perspective is going to be developed inshallah. I say to you, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.